I knew the moment he looked at me that something had already gone wrong, but I didn't expect it to happen like this, not across a dinner table, not with my daughter sitting between us pretending everything was still normal, while her husband slowly reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope in front of me like it was something heavy enough to change the direction of my life. And maybe it would have if I hadn't already seen it coming days before this night ever began. He didn't smile when he did it, and that was the first thing that told me this wasn't a misunderstanding or some awkward family conversation that needed smoothing over, because men like him always smile when they think they're in control. But this time there was something colder behind his eyes, something rehearsed, or something that had been building quietly while I watered my plants and lived my small, simple life that he clearly believed he understood completely. "You should open it," he said, and his voice was steady, too steady, the kind of calm that comes from someone who believes the outcome has already been decided. And for a second I almost admired it, because confidence like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from certainty, from thinking you've already won, from believing the person across from you doesn't even know the game has started yet. My daughter shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, and I noticed the way she avoided looking at me, which told me more than anything else in that room, because she knew something, not everything, but enough to feel uncomfortable. Enough to realize that this dinner wasn't just about introductions or family or polite conversation, and yet she said nothing, which meant she was waiting, just like he was, just like everyone at that table was waiting for me to make the first move. I rested my hand on the envelope, but didn't open it, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to make him uncomfortable, just long enough for the confidence in his posture to shift ever so slightly. Because here's the thing about moments like this: the person who moves first is the person who loses control, and I had spent far too many years building my life to hand that control over to someone who thought a piece of paper could scare me into submission. "You seem very sure of yourself," I said quietly, watching him carefully, studying the way his jaw tightened, just a fraction, of the way his eyes flickered toward my daughter before returning to me, and in that small movement I saw it, the truth hiding behind his confidence, the crack in the performance, the single mistake he didn't realize he had already made because he thought he knew who I was. He didn't. And that was about to cost him everything. The truth is, people only see what you allow them to see, and for most of my life I made sure they saw very little, because there is a certain kind of power in being underestimated, a quiet advantage that grows over time, while others reveal themselves too quickly, too loudly, too confidently. And my son-in-law was exactly that kind of man, the kind who walked into rooms believing he already owned them, even when he had no idea who actually did. I built my life slowly, deliberately, without attention, without noise, and certainly without the kind of display that invites questions, because I learned early that visibility attracts problems, and problems attract people who think they can take something from you. So I chose simplicity, an ordinary house, ordinary routines, a life that looked small from the outside but was anything but, and I protected it carefully, especially when it came to my daughter. She grew up in that quiet world, never fully understanding what stood behind it, only knowing that things were always stable, always secure, and maybe that was my mistake, because when she met him, she saw something exciting, something different, something loud and confident and ambitious, and I saw something else entirely, something polished but incomplete, something that had never truly been tested, but I stayed silent, because sometimes people need to learn who others are on their own. When she introduced him to me, he shook my hand with confidence, looked me in the eye, and spoke to me like I was exactly what I appeared to be, a simple man living a simple life. And I let him believe it, because there was no benefit in correcting him, not then, not yet. And over time he grew comfortable, too comfortable, the kind of comfort that turns into quiet arrogance, the kind that makes a man forget to ask the right questions. The opportunity came later, unexpected, but perfectly timed, when a position opened in a company that most people would recognize immediately. A company that had grown quietly but steadily for years, expanding without drawing attention, building influence without announcing it. And when I saw his profile cross my desk, I recognized the potential immediately, not just in his skills, but in what this situation could reveal about him. He never knew how he got the job, never questioned the process, never considered that someone behind the scenes might have influenced the outcome, and to be fair, he earned his position. His abilities were real, his decisions were sharp, and for a while I watched him closely, observing how he handled pressure, how he treated people, how he carried himself when he believed no one important was watching. For months, everything appeared stable, almost reassuring, and I allowed myself to think that maybe I had misjudged him, maybe my instincts had been overly cautious, maybe my daughter had chosen well after all. But there were moments, small ones, barely noticeable, where something beneath the surface shifted. Something subtle that didn't belong, and I've learned over the years that those small moments are never meaningless. They are warnings, and I never ignore warnings. The shift didn't happen all at once, and that's what made it dangerous, because real betrayal rarely announces itself with a single moment. It builds quietly, layering small decisions on top of each other, until one day you realize the person you trusted has been moving in a completely different direction all along, and by then, the damage is already done, even if you haven't fully seen it yet. I started noticing it in the way he spoke about the company, not openly, not in ways that would alarm anyone else, but in subtle changes, a certain tone when he thought he was ahead of something, a confidence that didn't match the information he had access to, and at first I told myself it was ambition, the kind that drives people to succeed, but there is a line between ambition and assumption, and he was getting very close to crossing it. One evening, my daughter mentioned something casually, something that might have meant nothing to someone else, but to me it was a signal, a small piece of information that didn't fit, and when I asked a few quiet questions, she hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for me to know that she was holding something back, not intentionally, but because she didn't realize the weight of what she knew. "He's been under a lot of pressure," she said, trying to keep it light, but her voice carried that same uncertainty I had seen at the dinner table, and I nodded, letting her believe I accepted that explanation. Because pushing her would only make her defensive, and I didn't need her to explain anything yet. I just needed to listen, to watch, to let the situation reveal itself fully before I made any move. The confirmation came sooner than I expected, and it didn't come from him. It came from the kind of place people forget about when they think they're in control, the background, the details, the conversations that happen when no one important is supposed to be paying attention. And what I found wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a plan, quiet, structured, and already in motion. He had been speaking to people he shouldn't have been speaking to, sharing information that wasn't his to share, positioning himself in ways that suggested he believed the company was already his to shape, his to control, and more than that, there was another layer, something deeper, something tied to a story from years ago, a story I thought had ended long before he ever entered my life. When I saw the connection, everything became clear, the confidence, the timing, the subtle shifts in his behavior. It wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence, it was intentional, and suddenly that dinner invitation made sense in a way I hadn't fully understood before, because this wasn't just about business, and it certainly wasn't just about family. It was about something older, something unfinished, and he believed he was the one who was going to finish it. He believed he was the one in control. That was his mistake. By the time that envelope touched the table, I already knew enough to understand what he thought he was doing. But knowing something and seeing it unfold in front of you are two very different experiences, because in that moment, across that table, with my daughter sitting there holding her breath without realizing it, the situation stopped being theoretical and became something real, something immediate, something that required precision. I let the silence stretch deliberately, not as a reaction, but as a decision, because silence has weight when it's used correctly, and I could feel it settling over the table, pressing against him, testing his confidence, and sure enough, it began to show in small ways, the shift in his posture, the tightening in his jaw, the brief glance toward my daughter, as if looking for reassurance that this was still going, according to whatever plan he had constructed in his head. "You should read it," he repeated. A little less steady this time, and I noticed it, the slight crack beneath the surface, the first sign that he hadn't prepared for resistance, that he expected me to react exactly the way he had imagined. Shocked, defensive, uncertain. And when I didn't, when I simply looked at him without moving, without giving him what he wanted, the balance of the moment began to tilt. "What exactly do you think this is?" I asked, not raising my voice, not adding any emotion, just a simple question placed carefully between us. And for the first time since this dinner began, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough, because hesitation reveals doubt, and doubt spreads quickly when someone realizes the situation isn't unfolding the way they expected. "It's information," he said finally, trying to regain control, trying to sound certain again. But the rhythm was off now, the confidence forced rather than natural, and I could see it clearly, the realization beginning to form behind his eyes that something about this was not aligning with his expectations, that maybe he didn't have the full picture after all. My daughter finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual, almost cautious, asking what was going on, and he answered her without looking away from me, which told me everything I needed to know, because his focus wasn't on her. It wasn't on the situation as a whole, it was on me, on how I would respond, on whether his plan would hold under pressure. "It's just something that needs to be addressed," he said. But the words felt thinner now, less convincing, and I could see her confusion growing, her uncertainty, or the way she shifted slightly in her seat as if trying to find stability in a moment that was becoming increasingly unstable, and still I didn't open the envelope. Instead, I leaned back slightly, studying him the way I had studied far more complicated situations over the years, and I realized something important, something that changed the entire direction of what was about to happen, because this wasn't just about what he knew, it was about what he didn't know, and that gap between those two things was about to break him. I finally opened the envelope, but not because he told me to, and not because I needed to see what was inside, because I already knew the shape of it, the intention behind it, the carefully selected pieces meant to create a version of the truth that served his purpose. And as I flipped through the pages slowly, deliberately, I watched him, not the documents, because his reaction mattered more than anything written on paper. There it was, exactly as expected, fragments of an old story, names pulled from a past he barely understood, transactions without context, decisions stripped of the reasons behind them, all arranged neatly to suggest something that wasn't entirely false, but was far from complete, and I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I had already suspected. "You've been busy," I said calmly, placing the papers back into the envelope and sliding it slightly toward him, and the way his eyes sharpened told me he was waiting for something more, an argument, a denial, some kind of reaction that would validate his position. But I gave him none of that, and that was when the shift truly began. "I think you've misunderstood what you're dealing with," I continued, keeping my voice even, controlled, because volume wasn't necessary, not when the truth was already sitting there, waiting to be spoken. And I could see it now, the uncertainty creeping in again, the confidence starting to fracture under the weight of something he couldn't yet define. "What I'm dealing with is very clear," he replied, trying to hold on to his certainty, but it was slipping now, and he knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it. And that's when I reached into my own jacket and placed a much thinner envelope on the table between us, unremarkable, almost forgettable, except for the way it changed everything the moment it appeared. "This is what you're missing," I said, and I didn't push it toward him, I didn't rush the moment, I simply let it sit there, because the power of it wasn't in the paper itself, it was in what it represented, the part of the story he never considered, the part that rewrote everything he thought he knew. He hesitated before picking it up, and that hesitation told me everything, because now he was the one reacting, the one stepping into uncertainty, and as he opened it, I watched his expression change, slowly at first, then all at once, the confidence draining from his face as the realization hit him piece by piece. "That's not possible," he said under his breath, but it had always been possible. He just never asked the question that would have led him to the answer, and that was the difference between us. I asked questions long before I needed the answers. "You've been running that company for over a year," I said quietly, letting the words settle, letting them sink in fully before I continued, "and you never once thought to find out who actually owns it." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because now, finally, he understood. He wasn't in control. He never was. For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence felt different from the ones before, heavier, final, the kind that settles after something irreversible has already happened. And I watched him carefully as the realization moved through him, not all at once, but in stages. Disbelief first, then calculation, then something quieter, something closer to understanding. Because once the truth is clear, there's nowhere left to hide from it. My daughter looked between us, her confusion now fully visible, her eyes searching for something stable to hold on to. And I could see the moment she began to understand as well, the way her expression shifted, the way her posture changed slightly as the pieces started to connect in her mind, and I felt a brief weight in my chest, not regret, but the recognition that some lessons arrive all at once, without warning. "You own it?" she asked, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. And I nodded once, keeping my gaze steady, because this wasn't a moment for explanations yet. This was a moment for truth, simple and undeniable. And as those words settled into the space between us, everything else began to rearrange itself around that reality. He leaned back slowly, the envelope still in his hand, but now it meant nothing, just paper, just fragments of a story that had lost its power, the second the full picture came into view. And I could see it in his face, the shift from control to awareness, the recognition that every decision he thought was his had been made inside a structure he never saw. "I didn't know," he said finally, and this time there was no performance in it, no calculated tone, just a statement, plain and unguarded, and I believed him, because ignorance often wears the same face as confidence until it's exposed, and then it becomes something else entirely. "I know," I replied, and I meant it, because this was never about what he knew. It was about what he chose to do with what he didn't know, the assumptions he made, the actions he took without understanding the full weight of them, and those choices, more than anything else, were what brought us to this moment. The room felt different now, quieter in a way that didn't need to be filled, and I could sense the shift, not just in him, but in everything around us, the balance resetting, the tension dissolving into something more grounded, more real, because once control is revealed, there's no need to fight for it anymore. "You built all of this," he said after a long pause, not as a question, but as a realization, and I nodded again, because there was no reason to deny it, no reason to hide behind simplicity anymore, not when the truth was already sitting between us, clear and unshakable. "Yes," I said calmly, letting the word stand on its own, and in that moment there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reveal, because the only thing that mattered had already been understood, and everything else would follow from that. Some people build power to show the world who they are. I built mine, so I would never have to. And this story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.